Tim,
Summersworth.
I wanted to very briefly mention that we have our sort of major event of the year coming up on April 21st. And this time it's going to be on campus. It's the annual Solanki Lecture, and we're very excited to have Farhad Manju from the New York Times join us to talk about technology and its futures. And
yesterday,
so please do keep a lookout in your email and in social media for further news about this event. I think it should be absolutely fabulous. And again, it's live and in person on Thursday, April 21st. So let me now pass it on to Tim.
Hey, everybody. Welcome. I'm Tim Kern. I'm the director of the center, and I'm also the chair of the secondary education program here at Cal State Long Beach. And it's really my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker and who's also going to, I think, lead us in a conversation about something, a very timely topic. This is Dr. Tanvi Madan, who's a senior fellow in a foreign policy program at Brookings Institution. So she's joining us from Washington, DC. She's also the director of the India project at Brookings, and she has a really interesting academic background in terms of her interdisciplinarity. She got her BA in history at Lady Shri Ram College in New Delhi. She's got a master's degree in international relations at Yale, and she also has a PhD in public policy from UT Austin, so from the University of Texas. Right? Tanvi has published numerous articles on India's foreign policy, as well as in media outlets such as The Economist, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and numerous other media outlets. She's also appeared on numerous shows and news shows, including BBC, Bloomberg, PBS, and India Today, the TV version. She recently published a really interesting book, and I'm going to make a shameless plug for it. And I was talking to Tanvi, I haven't quite finished it, but I'm very impressed by it. And it's called Fateful Triangle: How China Shaped U.S.-India Relations During the Cold War. And in this book, she very much so surfaces how China informed U.S.-Indian relationships and Cold War alignments, and gives a lot of agency to China relative to, I think, where Pakistan has gotten most of that focus. And at the same time, I think she's also done a really interesting job of sort of shifting how we look at India during the Cold War towards East Asia, if you like. And I'm sure she'll have many things to say about that. I'd point out that at the center, we're running a Solanki Teacher Scholar program at the center, where we're working, and a few of these teachers are in the audience, where we have 30 teachers from across the United States that are working intensively with us in workshops about how to think about South Asia in the early modern and modern period in terms of teaching it in high school classrooms. And in April, it was interesting, I was talking with Mihir, and I said, I'd really like to invite Tanvi, you know, this is a really important book, because in April, we're going to talk about South Asia and the Cold War, which is a topic that most American high school students know nothing about or learn nothing about. And then lo and behold, her work on India, China, and the United States has all of a sudden, since February, a completely new relevance, right? And we're very interested in hearing her speak about this in the context of understanding India's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? And this is, in fact, the subject that she's going to talk about, and then we'll have a conversation about it. So please welcome Tanvi. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Tim and Mihir, and it's lovely to be with all of you. And I just learned that spring break starts tomorrow, so I'm particularly grateful for those of you who've taken the time to join this. I often say that you know, I've been trained in an interdisciplinary way, but I'm a historian at heart, and that has actually helped me even analyze Indian foreign policy in the more contemporary sense. Because one of the things I say is that you cannot understand India's foreign policy today, or even try to think about what it will be in the future, without thinking about the historical legacy, not just kind of the fact that India is a post-colonial country, and that very much shapes the prism through which it sees the world. And we can talk a little bit more about that perhaps in the conversation. But even understanding, for example, what I am going to be talking about today, India's approach to the Russia-Ukraine war, you can't really understand it without thinking about the history of India in the Cold War, but particularly India-Russia relations. You can't think about India's approach without thinking about India-Russia relations today, and you can't think about India-Russia relations today without knowing about or understanding the historical legacy of that relationship from the Cold War, particularly from the 70s and 80s. I'll start with, just to give you a sense, a little bit of a roadmap of the things I'll talk about. I'll just talk a little bit about the India-Russia relationship, because as I mentioned, it's crucial to thinking about how India has approached this crisis, talk a little bit about the stakes for India as it saw Russia invade Ukraine, and then talk a little bit about its approach. What is the approach that it's taken? What has it done? What has it not done? And then finally, kind of talk a little bit about some of the potential implications of the crisis in Europe for India, as well as for India's relationship with not just Russia, but the US, China, and others. Let me start with India-Russia relations. I think most people still, and you see this in the coverage these days of kind of how India has abstained at the UN in certain votes. Most people think of this when they're analyzing this. They remember the Cold War India-Soviet relationship. And they will talk about this in the sense of saying, you know, India is non-aligned. And so this is the Cold War India-Russia relationship that is making a difference. And that India is anti-West for that reason as well. And they think of that India-Soviet relationship as essentially being the India-Russia relationship today, and as close as it was, particularly between 1971 and 1991. But today's India-Russia relationship is fundamentally different from that before 1991. And I think particularly in the last decade or two, you've really seen India kind of grapple with what I call the divergence relevance dilemma for India and that divergence kind of relevance dynamic in the India-Russia relationship. For India, one of the reasons for its very close relationship with Russia or with the Soviet Union during the Cold War was that it was strategically useful to India. After 1971 in particular, when India and the Soviet Union signed a treaty, but even before that in the 60s, one of the things that made Russia, or the Soviet Union rather, useful for India was that India and the Soviet Union, particularly after the Sino-Soviet split in the kind of 60s, but had been developing in the 50s. In the 60s and from that point, India and the Soviet Union shared a concern about China. So there was convergence on the subject of China, and that is what brought about kind of a Soviet-India alignment in the second half of the Cold War, so particularly after 1971, because by that point, the US, which had also agreed with India that China was a challenge in the 60s, after the US-China rapprochement, India was no longer useful to the US as a balancer to China, and the US was no longer available as what India thought of as an insurance policy against China if China ever attacked India again. So in the Cold War, you saw the Soviet Union and India kind of aligned on the subject of China. There was convergence on the fact that China was a challenge. And the Soviet Union helped India build up particularly its military capabilities, but to some extent its economy as well, to help deal with that China challenge, which the Soviet Union was also concerned about. But today, if you think about the India-Russia-China dynamics, today there's divergence between India and Russia on China. Yes, they are members of the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa grouping. They have a Russia, India, China trilateral. They're all members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that Russia and China started. But fundamentally, India sees China as its major external rival today, alone and in conjunction with Pakistan. While Russia, and today, thanks to a border crisis that's been going on between India and China since the last 2 years, you have an India-China relationship that is at its worst point since 1962, when India and China fought a war together. So you have an India whose relationship with China is at its lowest point since 1962. But as the Russian foreign minister put it even last year, so not just in the course of this crisis, but as he put it last year, Russia's relationship with China is better than ever before. And you're seeing that during the course of this crisis as well. So for India, it has a key divergence now with Russia on the subject of China. Russia sees it as its closest partner. India sees China as its most significant rival. India and Russia also have divergence on the subject of Pakistan. The India-Pakistan rivalry goes back to the two countries gaining their independence and to the partition in South Asia. But more recently, especially since about 2011, you've seen kind of, and Russia had been, or even Russia, the Soviet Union before, had been helpful to India as it tried to balance Pakistan. But again, more recently, and as I said, since about 2011, Russia has been reaching out to Pakistan as well, economically to some extent, politically, strategically, and even in the military space, where they have provided Pakistan some military assistance. They've been careful not to cross some of India's red lines with Pakistan, but nonetheless, Russia has been getting closer to Pakistan. One of the reasons Russia and Pakistan have got closer, though nowhere as close as Russia-China relations, is that both sides' relationships, both Russia and Pakistan's relationships with the US deteriorated. And what that meant was that they saw each other as part of kind of alternative partners. You also saw a lot of convergence amongst the two sides on the subject of Afghanistan, where you did see on Afghanistan earlier during the 1990s, you had seen Russia ranged alongside India, Iran, and backing the Northern Alliance against the Taliban, which was backed by Pakistan. But in recent years, you had seen that Russia had engaged with the Taliban while India was continuing, as the US was, to oppose the Taliban. But Russia was working with Pakistan, with Iran, with China to engage with the Taliban. And what India started being concerned about is not just was Russia that had helped it isolate the Taliban earlier, that Russia was engaging with the Taliban, but on top of that, it was on behalf of Pakistan, excluding India from certain conversations about Afghanistan. So you started seeing India kind of having this divergence with Russia, both on China and on Pakistan. And this would spill out on issues like Afghanistan, or even the subject of Burma, where China and Russia are far more aligned than India is with the Russian position. So you did see this kind of, for some of India's major concerns, major strategic concerns, you did see kind of divergence. You also saw an India-Russia relationship that, unlike during the Cold War, wasn't a very broad relationship. There was very little non-defense trade, and I'll just come to the defense trade side, but very little kind of going on, whether in terms of kind of trade and investment. So just to give you a sense of the numbers, Russia-India trade has been below $10 billion for the last, non-defense trade has been below $10 billion for the last 20 years or so. Compare that with India's trade with the US. It's about $130 billion, and that's just trade in goods. The services side increases that significantly. Even India-China trade is about $110 billion. Whereas Russia used to be one of India's largest trading partners. And so you see also things like educational exchanges, cultural influence, a number of students a lot of students from India used to go to the Soviet Union to study. But today, in Russia, there are fewer Indian students than there are in China. There were even more Indian students in Ukraine than there were in Russia as a whole. So the relationship didn't just see divergence in recent years, you also saw it become pretty one note. Having said that, despite that divergence in the India-Russia relationship, Russia continued to remain and continues to remain relevant for India. And this is for a few different reasons. Due to Russia's seat at various global and regional high tables, including at the UN Security Council, that makes it important to India in some ways. There are the legacy ties, and you particularly see this in the defense space, where when I said the Russia-India kind of ties can be pretty one note, that one note tends to be in the defense, trade, and technology space. India has been diversifying away from buying military equipment from Russia for various reasons, which we can talk about if you're interested in. But its existing military equipment is significantly still of Russian and Soviet origin. And so you see figures ranging from about 60 to 80% of current Indian military equipment, defense equipment, is of Russian origin. And this is related to India's approach to the Ukraine crisis, so I'll come back to this. But that defense relationship continues to kind of be the driver of the India-Russia relationship in the last many years. India also sees Russia as relevant in this space because it sees Russia as being willing to give and sell India certain advanced defense technologies that other countries won't, including nuclear-powered submarines, and helping India co-develop and co-produce equipment, including missiles that other countries won't. You also see Russia as being, you've seen in recent years some Indian investment in the Russian energy sector and some Russian investment as well in the Indian energy sector, but it's still has been quite minor. But there are, I think, there is one or two more reasons why India sees Russia as relevant. India's preference, and this is a historical preference, it's perhaps the most consistent element of Indian foreign policy, is a desire to keep a diversified portfolio of partners. So it's a diversification strategy where India does not ever want to get over-dependent on one partner. So while it has been getting very close to the US and US allies and partners, it does not want to give up its Russia relationship because it helps provide balance in this portfolio that it has generally kept. It also shares with Russia some concerns. For example, India, like Russia, tends to be a sovereignty hawk. It doesn't believe, it doesn't think other countries should be interfering in Indian domestic policy or what it thinks is domestic affairs. And Russia backs it up on that position. So you do see kind of some kind of overlap in that view of seeing whether it is in terms of how you think about sovereignty or in terms of wanting a multipolar rather than a unipolar world that India would also like to see. You see some overlap in the Indian and Russian positions. India has also wanted, because of these areas of relevance, India has also wanted to maintain its partnership because it wants to give Russia a non-China option. It doesn't want to see Russia have only China as its major partner, because, and I can come back to this if you'd like, but for India, whenever Russia-China relations have been very, very close, that has been a problem for India from a strategic point of view, because India has traditionally thought of not just countries like the US, Japan, and Australia as it's part of its balancing strategy vis-a-vis China. It's also wanted Russia to be part of that balancing strategy because of historical Russia-China differences, though that has not been the case for the last 10, 15 years or so. Now, I listed kind of these areas of relevance, but this Russian relevance for India can either be positive or negative. So, as India deals with kind of a range of challenges with particularly, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's China, whether it's the situation of Afghanistan, they think of Russia that it can take these areas of relevance and either be a supporter of Indian interests or it can be a spoiler of Indian interests. And so what ideally India has wanted to maintain a relationship with Russia so that it is a supporter at the very least India would like Russia to stay neutral and not be a spoiler for Indian interests. So for example, as India and China have been engaged in hostilities for the last 2 years at their border, India does not expect Russia to take India's side, has not expected that because of the Russia-China close relationship, but India has wanted Russia not to tilt towards China and not to stop military supply to India. But it is this relevance that is of Russia with India that is a huge factor shaping India's approach to the Ukraine crisis right now. Now, it's not the only factor. It's not the only stake involved. Indeed, India has relationships with almost every key country involved, including Ukraine, as this crisis is playing out. But nonetheless, this India-Russia relationship does explain the way India thinks about the relevance of Russia to its interests in a continued fashion is one of the major factors that's shaping its response. So what are some of kind of India's other stakes that it has? And I can talk individually about kind of India's relationship with each of these countries that is involved in the crisis. But beyond that, if you step back broadly, as India was watching the situation deteriorate in Europe, it had very much hoped that Russia would not invade Ukraine and had privately conveyed that to various officials in Russia. They had wanted to see, they understood that Russia might have security concerns about, or the concerns about European security architecture. Some were even sympathetic about Russia's concerns about NATO, but they did not want to see the situation resolved through a use of force. For various reasons. And that's because India, as it has found since Russia has invaded Ukraine, that India has several stakes in the situation. And many of its interests have been adversely affected by what's going on in the region. But these very stakes are also what have shaped kind of this approach that it's taken of keeping a kind of fairly neutral role that I'll come back to because it's an evolving approach that we've seen. What are some of these stakes? So I think primarily for India, first and foremost, what it was concerned about when Russia invaded Ukraine was the safety of more than 22,000 Indian nationals that were in Ukraine. Most of them were students, most of them particularly medical students, and that was a major concern for India, that they would be, and they were all over Ukraine, including closer to the Russia-Ukraine border. A second set of interests for India was economic. They've seen commodity prices rise significantly as a result of the invasion. This is coming at a particularly sensitive time for India as its economy is trying to recover coming out of COVID. Inflation has been high there, as it has been in a number of other places. And India is particularly concerned about oil prices now being quite high because India imports 85% of its of the crude oil that it consumes. And so high oil prices become problematic, especially at this rate, because India's budget earlier this year was planned on thinking that oil would cost about $70 a barrel. And so when it's at $100 a barrel, that's putting a lot of pressure on the Indian budget. It also, whenever oil prices are high, that potentially has political implications for Prime Minister Modi's party as well, and for other state governments as well. And so kind of that inflationary cost was a major concern of all commodities. But it wasn't just oil, and India got very little oil directly from Russia, only about 2%, but also things like fertilizers, edible oils. I think I didn't know how much edible oil India imported from Ukraine. I didn't know how much fertilizer India got from Ukraine either. But both those have now, so it's not just energy security concerns that India has, it's also food security concerns. That has become, so this whole range of kind of economic concerns that are spilling over from Europe into kind of India's thinking as it thinks of its concerns because of the Russian invasion. India also has a set of security concerns, its own parochial security concerns that have been affected or could be affected by the Russia-Ukraine war. The significant amongst that is defense supplies. What India has kind of been concerned about is that Russia, which is now, engaged in these prolonged hostilities, where you've seen its own equipment being kind of, having to put a lot more military equipment into the fight than it had expected to. But the Russian defense industries that supply India with spare parts and other supplies, they are now going to be entirely kind of focused on their own needs for now. There will also be concerns for India in terms of the defense supplies questions, because export controls that are now imposed on Russia's defense industry will kind of limit, constrain the technologies that India can get from Russia. But it's not just Russia that's a military supplier to India. Ukraine is too. So the Indian Navy, for example, uses most of even the ships that they have bought from Russia, the surface ships, they run on Ukrainian engines. And where those engines are made, Russia has been targeting those defense industries in Ukraine. India also flies a number of Antonov medium transport aircrafts. Its Air Force does, which help supply its border areas, particularly the border with China. And that facility, and India was in the process of upgrading those Antonov aircraft with Ukrainian assistance, but those facilities have been bombed as well. Now, this has implications for India, because one of the other things it's concerned about as a spillover of this crisis is that India's kind of defense picture, as it looks at it, they're quite concerned that while the world's focus was in or is in Europe, that China will take advantage of that distraction and take further action at India's border and try to escalate tensions there. And so the Indian security forces have been on alert. But what they're concerned about, that in the process of all this, they'll be short of these spare parts and supplies that do come from both Russia and Ukraine. So those are kind of the security concerns that India has in terms of the spillover impact of this crisis for India more parochially. There are also a set of strategic concerns that India has in terms of the kind of configuration of the relationships between major powers. What India is particularly concerned about is that as a result of this crisis, that the Russia-China relationship will get far closer. And India has little interest in a Russia that is more beholden to China, because the questions that is being asked in India is, what will happen if a Russia that gets closer and closer and more dependent on China, what will it do if and when China says to Russia, don't do this for India, do something against Indian interests, don't supply it during a war with us, give us intelligence on India. Now, this might seem like an abstract concern, but when India and China fought a war in 1962, the other thing that was going on at the time was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And because then the Soviet Union needed China's help, it needed China's support. The Soviet Union did stall on military supplies to India. It did give.
Back listening to Season's.
Sorry, oh, that's fine. So did give China assistance, including diplomatic support against India. And so this is a concern for India that strategically a result of however this war ends, that Russia will be much closer to China. India will also be concerned that India's position on now trying to balance its various interests in maintaining a relationship with Russia, while also kind of taking care of some of these other interests that I'll come back to, that what's happened is India's approach has complicated its ties with some of its closest partners, including the US, including countries in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, but also other Indo-Pacific partners like Japan and Australia. And what India was building these partnerships for was because these partners are in some ways far more useful to India in strengthening the Indian economy, its technological capabilities, its military capabilities vis-a-vis China than Russia was. And so India has been spending the last kind of 20 years building these relationships, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, aligning with many of these countries in the US, Indo-Pacific, and in Europe to balance China in the region and even globally. And so India's approach that it's taken in this crisis has complicated these ties. I think finally, another kind of very key stake for India that is involved in this is what you could consider a principle. There's the Indian foreign minister said, as we approach this crisis, we have to balance our beliefs and interests. Now, there's one thing that is both an Indian belief, so an Indian principle, but also an Indian interest, which is the belief in territorial integrity and sovereignty being respected. For India, this is one principle of international law, of the UN Charter, that it repeatedly has stressed. And it has stressed this both because it believes in the principle, but there's another reason. It is in India's parochial interest to do so, because it has two neighbors that claim that it has disputed borders with and claim part of the territory that India holds. And so India does not have an interest in seeing Russia succeed, or any country, large country, succeed in violating another country's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and that being accepted. So those are kind of the various stakes involved. But all these stakes that I mentioned, these stakes that have been these interests that have been adversely affected by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, are kind of having to compete with India's other priority, which is that India-Russia relationship, and particularly the Russian relevance for India. And so what you've seen is India take an approach that does not support, and India does not want to support or endorse the Russian invasion, which has adversely affected its interests, but it also does not want to isolate Russia. And this is not just an approach that this Indian government would have taken. It doesn't matter who was in power, they would have likely taken the same approach. Now, what explains this particular kind of approach of trying to kind of walk this tightrope of not wanting to support or endorse the Russians, but also not wanting to isolate them? There are two proximate reasons for why India, for example, has abstained from UN resolutions, why India has not criticized Russia by name. And those two proximate reasons is, one, a belief that condemnation is not the right way to go. India does not tend to condemn countries by name, particularly, now this is not a blanket rule, but it generally does not tend to condemn countries by name, particularly partners. But India has not even condemned China for the boundary crisis in the last 2 years, and they have a pretty tense relationship right now. India hasn't even condemned China or criticized China by name officially over the last 2 years. It's done so unofficially or through sources, etc. But India does not tend to condemn countries. Now, there are two reasons for why it's not condemning Russia and it doesn't condemn countries in general. One is that it believes that, it wants to protect its own interests that I mentioned earlier with Russia. But second, it thinks that when you condemn countries, you isolate them further, and it makes it harder to get them back to a path of dialogue. And so it wants to keep channels of communication open. But that is also that keeping the channels of communication open has also been important to India for that second reason I said, that second proximate set of proximate reasons that India has not wanted to condemn Russia. It needed to keep channels of communications open, partly because it needed to evacuate 22,000 of its citizens. There are still some Indians left in Ukraine, some of whom are fighting with the Ukrainians, but they got the bulk of Indian citizens out. And for that, they needed channels of communications, both with the Russians and the Ukrainians. And in part to also arrange humanitarian corridors, with not just the Indian students used, but other Ukrainians used to evacuate as well. There's also the concern that India has that it needed to keep the channel of communications with Russia open in case the Chinese forces at India's border did escalate the crisis. And India did not want a situation where, because it had upset President Putin by criticizing him, that Russia would have said, we are not going to supply you with military supplies any longer because you have upset us and criticized us. Now, some people ask, why hasn't India India is one of the largest purchasers of Russian military equipment. Doesn't India have market power? Can't they call Putin's bluff? For India, the Indian leadership, what they're concerned about is that, knowing President Putin's track record, he will sometimes cut off his nose to spite his face. So if he is upset with India, even if it ruins a potential market, he will punish India for it, perhaps by helping China out in a crisis if it erupts at the border. So those have been kind of the reasons you've seen India take a much more cautious approach, but you've seen the Indian approach evolve as, for example, it evacuated its citizens. You saw it taking a more forward-leaning position to at least indirectly criticize the Russians or create some distance between the Indian and Russian positions. So what has India been doing during the course of this crisis? There have been several elements to the Indian approach, and it has also, in particular, the diplomatic side of this has evolved. Part of kind of these elements have been, one is, as I said, its primary goal in the beginning was to evacuate Indian citizens, and it put together this all-of-government effort that involved not just dealing with the Russians and Ukrainians, but most of the countries neighboring Ukraine to get Indian citizens out. A second kind of element to India's response has been on the military side. Its military has put its forces on alert at particularly the China border in case there's a contingency that takes place there. But you've also seen the Indian military have to take stocks and assess their levels of stocks of military supplies that they actually have from Russia and Ukraine, what the gaps are, also potentially what the impact of this crisis on Russia's ability to supply India, where the shortfall is going to be for the Indian military that depends so much still on Russia and Ukraine as a source. You've seen another line of effort for India on the economic side, which is one, try to find ways to mitigate the commodity price increase. So finding alternative sources. Now, this has also become a little bit of a source of friction with particularly the US Congress here, but also the Biden administration to some extent, because part of what India has said is it will buy some Russian oil on discount that it is being offered. Not directly, it's going to buy it from the spot market, but nonetheless, that's been a subject of concern. You also have seen a whole range of effort on the diplomatic side, which has perhaps got the most attention here. So, for example, you've probably read about that India abstained on a range of kind of UN votes. India has also not, so it's not condemned Russia by name, not called out Russian aggression. But you've also seen India not call this officially an invasion or a war. It uses the terms hostilities or conflict. Having said that, Prime Minister Modi in political speeches and in Hindi and Urdu has referred to it as a war, but India has not done this officially as a government. Having said that, while there are these couple of things that India has not done in terms of condemning Russia by name, calling this a war, you have also seen India's position evolve, and particularly evolve since before the actual invasion, but even since over the last month. So how has it changed? For one, even though India abstained from the initial UN Security Council, and it's on the UN Security Council now as a non-permanent member, that even though you did see kind of India involve, kind of a vote or to abstain from that resolution, it did give what it calls an explanation of vote. And that explanation of vote, they conveyed that it was directed at Russia, which said that, while not naming it, saying it was deeply disturbed by the situation, saying that member states needed to not violate other member states' territorial integrity and sovereignty. And those were basic principles on which the international order is based. And they also called for Russia they called for a cessation of hostilities and separately back-briefed that was meant to be directed at Russia. You've also seen India, for example, go from earlier saying that the legitimate security interests of all countries should be respected, which was usually read, it's also something China used to say, and still says, which was taken as a kind of a pro-Russia position. India has dropped that reference. It no longer says a legitimate security interests of all sides need to be respected. because India's point is that, look, even if Russia does have some concerns about NATO, nothing justifies kind of violating another country's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Another way you've seen India's approach, diplomatic approach, change is Prime Minister Modi has had several conversations. He's had 3 phone calls since the invasion with President Putin and 2 phone calls with President Zelensky. In the calls with President Putin, one the day of the invasion, the Indian readout of that conversation said that Prime Minister Modi said Russia and NATO should have a dialogue to resolve the situation, suggesting this was kind of a part of a great power politics game, and that needed to be resolved between the major powers. The last conversation he had with President Putin, he said to President Putin, according to the Indian readout, that President Putin should sit down with President Zelensky and resolve this situation bilaterally, recognizing that this is a Russia-Ukraine situation, and that is where it should be resolved. And this was about kind of territorial integrity and sovereignty as an issue. The very fact also that Prime Minister Modi is continuing to speak with and engage with President Zelensky is also an Indian signal to the Russians that India recognizes President Zelensky as the legitimate leader of Ukraine, and that Ukraine sees Ukraine as a sovereign country that does have a right to exist, contra some of the statements that President Putin has made. You've also seen India, unlike China, which has joined some Russian disinformation efforts, India actively reject some Russian efforts at disinformation. One of the things President Putin was saying publicly, that Indian students couldn't leave Ukraine because the Ukrainians were taking Indians hostage. The Indians rejected that vociferously, saying the Ukrainians were not doing that. In fact, they were quite helpful. India's also kind of criticized the Russians for shelling nuclear facilities in Ukraine, and rejected claims of kind of these bio-warfare labs that China and Russia have been putting out there. Finally, what India has done is provide Ukraine with kind of humanitarian assistance, including medical assistance, including for those evacuating. And you could see India, for instance, have a conversation about how to help the food security situation globally, but particularly that might play out in Africa and the Middle East, where there are concerns about political stability because of shortages of things like wheat. India has a surplus of wheat this year, and so it's one of the things that India is talking about with other countries. And you could see, for instance, India take a more leading role in having that discussion. It is also in touch with not just the US pretty regularly, but also with Australia, Japan, several European countries. So I'm going to kind of stop here and not do the final section of implications. I'll just mention a couple of things that maybe we can talk about this in the actual discussion. But one of the questions that this has thrown up a range of questions for India, some of which that are more long-term, and they will really be shaped by factors including the duration of this crisis, the outcome of this crisis, the state it leaves Russia in, it leaves Russian defense industrial base in, but also, what does this do to Russia-China ties? For India, there are more parochial questions. How much pressure is this going to put on India's relationship with the US? The US understands that India has this a legacy relationship with Russia. It understands it intellectually, and it has said that it will help India diversify its sources of defense equipment. But at the same time, clearly, especially members of Congress, but even the administration have not been very happy about the Indian position. They would like to see India take a more forward-leaning position. Having said that, and this is learning from history, 10, 15 years ago, you would have, when the India-US relationship was less developed, you would have seen a Biden administration that publicly criticized India. They've now recognized that that has the exact opposite effect. It's counterproductive. India then gets defensive and criticizes the US. And so what the conversations that have been had have tended to be, at least between the Biden administration and the Modi government, have tended to be private, and they've discussed those differences. So I think much will depend on how they discuss these differences and manage these differences on this question. But I think there are also some tough questions for India in in the kind of time ahead, not just how is it going to deal with and respond to a deteriorating situation. It's only likely to get worse. Russian actions could escalate, including the potential use of chemical or biological warfare, or even potentially tactical nukes. There are more civilians being attacked. How is India's position going to evolve further? And then finally, India, strategically, has been trying to do two things that it will now have to reconcile, and it's going to become much harder. India has been trying to work with the US, with Australia, with Japan, with France, with the UK, to align with China, but it does not want to align with them to isolate Russia. And so how do you align with a certain set of countries to balance China, but not isolate Russia, particularly as Russia-China alignment is growing? And so that's going to be one of the fundamental challenges for the Indian policymakers in the time ahead. And I'll stop there because I've already gone longer than I had hoped to by about 10 minutes. I'd hoped to do this in 30 minutes, but closer to Mihir's 45 that he had given me earlier.
Well, thank you. That was a fascinating presentation and so useful because, at least from my perspective, here in the US, you sometimes get a very thin sense of how other nations think and the complexity of their decision-making. So I really appreciate that. I was going to request that if folks have questions, we're a small enough crowd where we can, I think, just talk to each other. But if you would like, you can also pop your questions into the chat. But I thought, just to kick it off, I wanted to just ask you, Tanvi, you gave your presentation, the actors were all unitary, There was India, there was China, there was Russia, there was Ukraine. To what degree are these states unitary actors in conflicts like these? Are they different factions that inflect these conversations in different ways in India itself, and then also perhaps as this crisis unfolds in these other nations?
So I think, it's a great question. And I think it's the nature of the issue that makes it somewhat unitary. So there's not one view on this, on the war in India. There's been both some people, and there's this interesting thing where there are members of India's right and members of India's left who have come together and said that India should take a more critical position of the US. And that, why is the US and Europe sanctioning Russia? And that, Russia's security concerns vis-a-vis NATO is what has caused this, all this, and that India should actually be supporting Russia more openly. Now, some of this is not even a demand for support for Russia. To some extent, it comes from skepticism of the West, and particularly the US. There's some who don't like, the idea of sanctions. India itself has been sanctioned in the past, and so they see sanctions. The Indian government's concerned more about secondary sanctions, that they will be kind of affected. Some of their companies will be affected by it. But there's a broader kind of concern among some who, not because they support Russia, they just don't like the idea of sanctions being used in the way they have been. Against countries, and that have affected India, especially economically. So, for example, India no longer has not been buying oil from Iran and Venezuela that had been traditional suppliers for many years because of US sanctions. So, they point out now we can't buy from Russia either. And even though it's a small supplier, it means that oil prices are high. So you see from different perspectives, some saying, but what you've also seen, which is a change from the historic norm, which is you've seen a lot of criticism of Russia in newspapers, and not just English language, but even the vernacular press, that actually sees this, has focused on the kind of international law aspect of this. That this is fundamentally about a violation of territorial integrity and sovereignty, and it is an invasion and should be called out as such. And so you've seen kind of a much more, you've seen much more criticism than you used to. And, like everywhere in the world, you've seen that this is playing out on people's TV screens. You've seen it play out on, Twitter. Indian journalists, the Ukrainians, as part of kind of their, their information ops. They had invited a whole number of Indian journalists who, were in these war zones and seeing, civilians, Ukrainian civilians being shelled. And this is the first time that an Indian audience on their TVs are seeing the consequences of Russian military action on civilian population. Syria wasn't covered that much. You didn't really see. So you are seeing kind of voices in India now really kind of expressing concern about what Russia is doing. But in terms of who the decision makers are, it is, foreign policy, especially on an issue like this, which is not, public opinion to some extent can be a constraint in India on China and Russia, on China and Pakistan. But on something like this, usually you do see kind of fair amount of, it's the government that has some leeway in making policy. So the constraints tend to be these other factors that I've talked about and not really public opinion. And so you've seen there are debates that aren't quite visible. There probably are within the government about, what language to use, how much to criticize Russia or not criticize Russia. Some of it depends on what ministry you sit in. So if you're in the, energy ministry, you're saying, I'm the petroleum and natural gas minister. I want to take, advantage of these kind of low prices that are being offered. Foreign ministry is probably thinking about kind of this from a strategic perspective and how this will impact relations with others. So I think you do see differences, but at the end of the day, you are seeing kind of a position that was quite predictable because these structural constraints on the Indian government push it in a certain direction. Now you've seen evolution as the situation has changed, but broadly, I think you have seen this kind of the government at least speak in one voice on this, and they are the deciders on this. And this government in India in particular, you'll see, 3 or 4 figures. The Cabinet Committee on Security has met a number of times, but it also included, just because of the sheer impact of a crisis like this, the kind of food ministers, the commerce minister, the petroleum and natural gas minister. So you saw a wider range of actors kind of meeting to discuss this. There have been some, there isn't a partisan divide on this. The Congress party has also said that it doesn't want to criticize Russia, but you also see some strange bedfellows amongst the right and left who have come out and criticized Russia. And they partly criticized Russia because they say, what has it done for us lately other than, ally with our adversary, China? And so you're seeing kind of an interesting discussion. It's not a unitary discussion in India. India is, getting a lot of information on this, including being, targeted by Russian disinformation efforts. And, the Ukrainians also have their own information kind of operations, even disinformation to some extent. And so you are seeing, the Indian public as such, which is pretty active on Twitter as well, engage in these kind of global discussions. So I think, it's not unitary in terms of the debate, but it is unitary in terms of decision making. I think, for Russia, I think part of the problem is it is unitary, as we're seeing. I mean, one of the concerns that is being expressed about, not just Russia with Putin, but even China and Xi Jinping is you've seen these two countries now in the last 4 or 5 years take steps that are entirely counterproductive to their own interests. So you've seen Xi Jinping's China kind of act assertively against almost every one of its neighbors. And so they've turned countries like India, Australia, Japan into China hawks in the last few years. Now, IR theory would tell you the last thing you want to do, or forget IR theory, every one of the kind of strategists that you read going back to Kautilya in the Indian kind of context, Machiavelli in the European one, everybody will say, or Sun Tzu in the Chinese sense, you don't want all your neighbors or a significant number of your powerful neighbors to form a balancing coalition against you. And yet China has taken these actions. Similarly with Russia, it has achieved the very thing it was saying it was fighting against or trying to avoid: a strengthened NATO, a rearmed Germany, more NATO forces near its borders, not to mention, tanked its own economy in the process of this invasion. And so you're seeing, and having oil that it's unable to sell on the market, which was its major kind of weapon. So this question of, one of the things I think people are thinking about is, why are these taking these decisions? And one of the constraints is, they don't have people around them who are telling them, who have the ability to tell them you're wrong, and give them disconfirming evidence. To the extent that we're seeing in Russia, people are trying to do that. They seem to be kind of be detained, whether it is the FSB head, whether it is a lead Russian general. So I think, part of the thing is, for all the messiness of democracies, at least there is a debate on these issues in different ways of kind of, different power centers, and the publics get to debate these things. You're not seeing that. And in both China and Russia, information has been pretty controlled on this.
Thank you. How about we go now to Praveena and then to Tim.
Thank you so much. That was such a wonderfully comprehensive history lesson, actually, for me. But I was wondering, what is the difference in policy on Kashmir between Russia and Ukraine, and in terms of how they've supported or not supported the whole idea that Kashmir is a domestic issue? That's number one question. And number two is, how much does Kashmir figure in India's foreign policy, whatever its decision making?
So it's interesting, in many senses, it figures in a pretty major way in even how India thinks about what it says and does at the UN. So one of the reasons it even says, it's a sovereignty hawk is partly because of Kashmir. It says, look, we don't want other countries mediating. This is not, they did take it to the UN and have regretted it ever since, because they felt, the resolutions, everybody remembers one part of the resolution, or the second part of the resolutions, not the first. But regardless, it has, I think, shaped a significant amount of Indian thinking about international law. But it's also in a different sense, the Russian position on Kashmir it used to be the Indian veto when it was the Soviet Union in the Cold War, but it hasn't really exercised. Kashmir really hasn't come up at the UN Security Council for many, many years. But even at the UN Security Council, when, for example, a few years ago, India kind of revoked Kashmir autonomy with this Article 370, China, on behalf of Pakistan, wanted to bring this up at the UN Security Council, even if not in a meeting, in a formal meeting or a meeting. It was the US and France that helped India kind of keep this off, keep this meeting kind of small, and not have a statement. The Russians actually either stayed silent or sided with China on this. And so, even on that, even though they did not criticize, so the Russians did not criticize India for this Article 370 move bilaterally, and they said this is an internal affair. At the UN, they were not helpful to India. And so what you're seeing is, in the international sense, Kashmir, essentially, countries' positions on Kashmir are really reflective of that kind of great power politics and where you stand. And so, as one of the concerns India has had is that as Russia's got closer to China, it has started allying or aligning with China at the UN as well, including on subjects like Kashmir. I think in terms of kind of the precedent reason, Russians have been trying to say to India, you should be seeing what we are doing in with Ukraine, with your right to be able to, if there's a terrorist attack from Pakistan or, in Kashmir, that you should be able to take action. And they cited this 2019 kind of the Indian Air Force going into crossing the border in Pakistan. The Indian government doesn't have that position because India's stance was that, one, Ukraine's an entirely independent country, it's not Kashmir. In fact, that people draw usually the analogy with Taiwan more often, but that Ukraine is an independent country, and this is it's recognized by the UN. It's a UN member state. But it also, says that whatever actions it took in 2019, India's stance is that was not a violation of, that wasn't crossing borders to take over this thing. It was a preemptive action against terrorist camps. Now, there's a huge debate about whether they struck anything or anything like that. But regardless, the Indian government is not drawing that analogy. If anything, what they're concerned, why they're concerned about the territorial integrity and sovereignty issue is because both Pakistan and China claim parts of what territory that India holds on some of the similar lines that Putin claims Ukraine, or has said justified his action. And so, for example, China says this about Arunachal Pradesh, which is we have historical rights. The people there have closer ethnic linkages to us than to you guys. And third, you were when we take military actions because you took some actions or built some partnerships with the US and Japan and others that kind of hurt our security. And so it is our right to take military action. Same thing on the Kashmir side. So that's why for India, in some ways you can argue this both ways, but India doesn't argue it the way Russia does, that there is an analogy. There they say, Ukraine's a separate country. Kashmir is, an integral part of India as India holds it. But they do have, I think, with Russia and with China to some extent, though, every one of these three countries' track record on not interfering in other countries' internal affairs is a bit slim. But you do see kind of India in that sense. The Russians don't comment or rarely comment on Indian domestic politics. And that is where you're seeing more of the difference, whereas the US, Europe, others do. And so that's where you do see kind of more like-mindedness between India and Russia. Kashmir has become less so. In fact, India has been concerned that even during the last India-Pakistan crisis in 2019, the Russians didn't actually take India's side. And India was upset about that because it followed an attack in India, and the Russians, in fact, offered to mediate. So they said they wanted to be even-handed, and so that's become the Russian position on that has become a little muddier than it used to be.
Thank you.
Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad we're taping this because I want to share this with the teachers that we're working with. I'm really interested in, most of your talk was about these strategic concerns, but I was interested in how you tried to reconcile a sense of belief, if you like, to those strategic concerns, and that belief being around the notion of, territorial sovereignty. But it seems to me there's another belief that is sort of strong in India's identity, particularly relative to China. And it's not just in India, but this notion of being democratic, right? And we can argue forever to the extent to which it is democratic, the United States is democratic, but nonetheless, right, the US identity, the identity of NATO, EU is revolving around the sense of sort of being democratic. And then we've got India, we've got Israel, I believe South Africa is another country that has been unwilling to directly condemn Putin. I just wonder how that plays out. And it plays out in my head as well as a historian, where there's a lot of focus on the geopolitical and the strategic, but I'm also, I find very compelling arguments that are being made that this is less, Putin's actions are less about geostrategic concerns and they're more about domestic political concerns. They're more about his greatest anxiety, in fact, is Navalny, is young Russians who are modern and seeing themselves as European, and with that identity comes a democratic one, as flawed as it may be. I just wondered how that plays into this, because it's, Putin's clearly not democratic.
I think, identity, I mean, I think it plays a huge role on both sides. My colleague Fiona Hill, who's a Russia expert and especially a Putin expert, she's been saying for months he will invade. And she was very kind of consistent about it. And she said it because, she said it is his vision of Russia, which is he thinks about imperial Russia, not the Soviet Union. So it's not just about NATO. He even criticizes Lenin, right, and Stalin for losing. And so I think there is that aspect, but she also, and I think she did a podcast with Ezra Klein recently that was very good and worth listening to. And she's a historian by training as well, which I always say this is why she's good at what she does. But she talked about kind of his fear of regime change and how that will, and what her concern is, because he will think he has nothing to lose because he has. He is concerned about, either kind of upheaval at home or that he will end up like Gaddafi or Saddam or others, that there isn't really an off-ramp out for him personally. But that it is, both his ideological belief in that there is a greater Russia. But I think you see this with many countries, right? You've seen this, I often think about this as the age of grievance. And you see this playing out across the world in different ways. You saw this in the US, in the UK, about kind of, grievance about a range of issues, whether it was economic, whether it was in terms of immigrants, whether it's in terms of others. But you also see it in the countries that have been, China, India, Russia, that have grievances about, the lost historical empires or kind of the civilizations that they had, that it was taken from them, and that they are trying to restore it. And there is that aspect that then builds into kind of the nationalist identity and has led to, now you can either go to that nationalism in a positive way, but I think you've seen Putin kind of do that. But then, it comes with that sense of loss / paranoia that others have taken it away from you and are continuing to be, but possibly kind of be out to get you, that they want to stop you. And so I think you see that, and even think about how many people he's actually let close to him in the last. You see these long tables, you see these virtual meetings, and so that kind of aspect when you are concerned. So I do think it matters that he is not a Democrat. Having said that, some say that there is support for maybe not. We don't know kind of how much, but that there is support for that vision that he is putting out there. And populist visions can be, I think, by their very nature, they're populist and can be popular and attractive, particularly if you're not offering anything else. And at least Putin has had kind of oil revenue to pump up, what he can provide to his people. But there were times even that was problematic. So I think, it does matter. I think in the Indian case, it's interesting. I think the identity that I see as stronger in some ways is this kind of real thing about, it's kind of a more post-colonial kind of concern about other countries telling India what to do. It does not want the US, Europe, others to be telling it what to do vis-a-vis Russia. It wants to make its independent choices. But it's also realized, for example, the strategic autonomy that it wants, the freedom of action, have been constrained by the fact that they have become over-dependent on Russia for, say, military supplies. And so you are seeing these conversations in India about, this is where the democracy aspect, this is being debated. So I don't think, I think it's quite different in that sense. So it was being debated in Parliament. The foreign minister went to, explain India's position, and he was asked questions from every side. So there's some people who criticize the government for not speaking out, and others. So I think you are seeing that, but I do think across the board, you do see this very strong strain of, don't tell us what to do, whether you are Russia or whether you are US. We will make these choices, and they won't always be the choices that you want us to make. So I think, it's more kind of to put it bluntly, I think it's a resistance against this with us or against us idea. And I think there is kind of this comfort level with a third way between the US and Russia, India still has kind of elements of being non-aligned. Between the US and China, I think that India is not so non-aligned. It is aligned. But it's aligned again there because it's in India's interest. So the way I think about this is, he wasn't foreign minister then, but the current foreign minister, when he was between kind of government positions, he was asked, I think it was General Petraeus, he was on a panel with him, and he turned around and he was talking about the US-China context, and he says, India needs to take a side. And the moderator asked, so is India going to take a side? And the foreign minister turned around and said, India will take a side. It will be India's side. It will be kind of the choices that India. So India will make choices. It makes choices that Russia doesn't like, but it will do it because India wants to. And so in fact, the most counterproductive thing often with India is kind of telling it what to do. And so some of the, in fact, backlash you've seen in India against kind of the US or European position has not been because of anything else, but they thought the US was lecturing India about what to do. So to me, I mean, part of it is kind of the democracy side of this, where frankly, the Indian government would have preferred that this democratic discussion, which was affecting its relations with the US, piped down a bit. But I think a lot of this is, I see it at least, especially in the foreign policy domain, even on kind of these questions, the identity issue is more that kind of, we are a re-emerging power when we have interests and ideas, and we will see it. I will tell you where the ideological prism, I think, we don't know enough. But one of the questions is, why did India not think that Russia was going to invade? I mean, India wasn't the only country, but India, especially the Indian policy establishment, they've studied Russia. There's still many Russia hands who are at senior levels of government who had done their training when it was the Soviet Union. And what they found is that you did have a situation where the Russians were telling them, we are not going to invade. The US and Europe, and now the US and India have an intelligence sharing relationship where India gets access to this information, was saying, yes, they are, and here's why we think they are. Why do you choose to believe why do you choose to believe that what the Russians are saying and not the US? Now, some of that could have been because, the US, you would have had analysts sitting and saying, well, US intelligence was wrong on Iraq, it was wrong on Afghanistan, the withdrawal, so, what should we really believe in? But I think to some extent, it is also that ideological prism that makes you say, Russia's been why would Russia kind of lie to us, so to speak? Why wouldn't they tell us? So,
I don't know if in a sense you've answered this question already, but why has it, if India's strategic relationship with Russia has been atrophying for nearly a half century, why has its security relationship remained so stable? So why has it taken over 40 years to begin to recognize, or to at least, to say that our defense dependence on Russian equipment is not very tenable, right, in the long term? Why has it, taken so long, and why has that security relationship remained so stable, if, especially as you say, these things have been unfolding for a very long time?
So it's actually decreased significantly. If you look at the last 4 years, I think India's purchases from Russia were about 40, 30, the numbers kind of vary depending on how about 38 to 45% of all defense kind of purchases were made from Russia. Now, it sounds like a lot, but then you think about how much it was in the kind of 4 years, 10, 15 years ago, in that same kind of duration of time, and that was 75 to 80% of all new purchases coming. So there has been an effort to diversify. Most of the new platforms, military platforms that India is buying now, the ones that it is buying from abroad, the Russians aren't even in the running. It's US, Israel, France, others. But there are some things that, for example, India is buying this S-400 missile defense system the Russians do it better, plus the Russians made an offer. And I think part of the reason India wasn't able to diversify is that countries weren't offering it, alternatives. And that was combined, so either alternatives that were better and kind of affordable on terms that India could buy, but there was also this kind of aspect of the Russians sometimes offered India technology that others just weren't willing to. So the US-India relationship has changed now. But 20 years ago, there was still US sanctions on India. 10 years ago, there was still export controls on India. 8 years ago, there was still export controls. So India didn't have as many options. There's also the other aspect of that, because the other way of reducing dependence is you produce at home. And that, there's entire books written on the political economy reasons why, there are these defense public sector companies that provide employment, etc. But then also, function like public sector companies that aren't as efficient. The private sector, there wasn't a defense industrial base in the private sector. It's only just being developed. So there is now much more of a focus, and it is odd that a country India's size is the largest importer of military equipment in the world. And so there is an effort, this government calls it Atmanirbharta, but it's essentially self-reliance that goes back to, since Nehru, India has been trying to do this, but it's been with very mixed success. And some of it is, the countries that you wanted to help you build the base thought, including the Russians, well, we'd rather keep keep the buyer-seller relation with you. So we'll help you on some things, but not others. It also just takes time to build these defense ecosystems. So now, for example, it's not just Russia. India is requiring, it's not buying any new equipment unless you actually co-produce some parts of it and co-develop even in India. So you see the javelins that are being used in Europe right now. 10 years ago, the US offered India that, let's co-develop and co-produce the next generation of this. But for India, they didn't think enough of the component of that was going to be produced in India. And so they said, well, still, you won't give us the technology, and it won't be enough of kind of a production at home. The problem, though, is sometimes I think there's this, in India, it's this waiting for these perfect deals, and you just need to take them when they're good enough. So I think now there is kind of a real, I think one of the second order effects of this is you're seeing a real, very publicly playing out discussion about Indian overdependence on Russia and how you actually reduce it. And not just because of what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, but the reality of the Russia-China relationship, and that you can't necessarily depend on Russia being a reliable supplier. And so, it might even be willing, but will it be able if its own defense industrial base is a mess? So I think you are seeing these questions being asked, but it requires, a top-down impact. And then I think finally, it's the budget, it's the guns versus butter argument. If you're going to build that base, then especially for the private sector, you need to say to them, we will buy, because there's only one buyer for this. You can export equipment, but the government has to commit to buying some amount of military equipment. And when there's so many other priorities for the Indian budget, it's just governments have preferred to put money towards other priorities. And, to some extent, it's hard to argue against that. But I think there's a combination now of this sense of urgency, but also the fact that, India suddenly was faced with the fact that with China, it had a set of agreements that it thought would hold, that you wouldn't find another war, that there wouldn't be conflict, and that's broken down. And so suddenly there is, I think, this combination of factors. There was a very good report written by Shriva Jaishankar, which I can send you the link, and you can, on what it would take to really kind of diversify and indigenize production, but also covers why it's not happening. And that's worth reading. But they're kind of all sorts of, I think, political economy, budgetary reasons. And then, India thought it had it had through dialogue, essentially it had deterred through dialogue. And now it's realizing it hadn't, that didn't work.
Thank you. Please.
I just wanted to make one comment that politically also it has been very difficult to diversify. And the two examples are Bofors and the current and the recent, during Modi government, the purchase of helicopters from France. So, the whole issue of corruption has been below the surface sort of problem in India, given the, a shortage of budget finance.
Absolutely. I think, I mean, you can't talk about this sector without talking about, corruption, and it plays out in both ways. One, nobody wants to sign deals, especially bureaucrats don't want to sign off on things because they get, left holding the bag. But second, their corruption is a problem. And, it in various ways, and it locks in a certain amount. But I think the lock-in effect is also broader and answers that question about, why you don't, why diversification has been slower, which is, it's the legacy equipment that's going to take time. You still need kind of Russian buy-in. Now, one of the things the US has said to India is not only will we offer you things that many of the things the Russians offer you, but we will help you even with spare parts and supplies, including from Eastern European countries that do produce or run Soviet or Russian military equipment. And India has relationships with those countries, with Poland, others. I am of the view that India will not want to wind down that relationship entirely. And if the US goes to India and says, we will make you these offers, but only if you promise never to buy from Russia again, India will say no. So if it's just an offer that we will give you the alternatives and slowly just wean India away, because the West offers better technology and at good terms, that's the better way to do it. But going back to that thing of that strategic autonomy that India wants to preserve, the Russians always understood that. They never said to India back in kind of the 60s, we'll sell you this if you promise not to buy from the US. The US missed an opportunity in the 60s when the US said, we'll sell you some of this stuff, but we'll only sell it to you if you stop buying from the Soviet Union, and if you let us tell you how much money you should spend on defense. So, going back to that question of also, making your own decisions and being a democracy, and this was, 15 years after India, it didn't want yet another Western country telling it, or outsiders telling it what to do.
Thank you. Are there other questions from others?
I just have one comment. One is that, when apart from the increase in price of oil, the other problem that India faces is because a very large proportion of its export itself, the total export budget is about 80% of the total import budget. And so what happens is that India's currency begins to devalue. And so, for example, there is close to 7 to 8% devaluation in the currency, despite the fact that it had become quite strong. And consequently, all import items become more expensive, not only oil. And although, the total foreign sector of India is relative to other large economies is quite small, it is still a concern of this devaluation of the currency. So that was one comment I just wanted to make. And the other comment I want to make is that I think there is a very strong anti-colonial bias, or whatever way you want to understand it, is the thinking of the state. It now sees Europe and the United States in some sense weakening, and therefore, and has never liked, as you have said, that the West is making all the decisions and so on, and including the current one of banning other countries that don't agree with you in this global context. So now I think that there will be, I think at the end of this particular event, whenever it happens, a sort of change in the whole international order of how international currency is going to be organized, because the old colonial system of the dollar being the reserve currency, in my view, is going to change. I don't think Chinese currency will replace it, but it has to come to some sort of a different kind of arrangement. So I'd like your comment on that. Thank you.
I think, we are still, this is a profound moment that I think we still are going to find out the effects. It's going to take a while, but I agree with you that I think, one of the things, those of us who kind of look a lot at contemporary, Indo-Pacific Asia policy is, what is the impact of this going to be in the region? And one of the areas is, what is China learning from this? And if I was China, I would be thinking, one, on the military side, will this happen to my military if I ever try to take Taiwan? And that's a harder military kind of scenario to actually undertake, because you had to cross the Taiwan Strait and have an amphibious landing, etc. And other than kind of the border crisis with India, China hasn't really fought, and they've had some peacekeeping operations, but the PLA hasn't actually fought a war since 1979. But the second thing I would be thinking if I'm China and watching, is I'm watching sanctions, and historic sanctions, things like, not having access to my own, central bank reserves. But also not just sanctions, even Western companies themselves unilaterally saying, I don't want to do business, it's become too toxic, I'm leaving.
Right.
And so if you're China, what folks in DC are hoping, China will look at all this, say, look, I don't know if my military is going to be able to do this, or I don't want to, mess up my whole economy for something that's uncertain, that I won't take action against Taiwan. That's the hope. But I think if you're China, and if you're sitting in Zhongnanhai, you're saying, how can I sanction-proof myself? And that's either, as you're saying, it's more thinking about alternative payment mechanisms, making the renminbi kind of more kind of a vehicle for payment. It is things like ensuring that this made in China thing, it increases, including a lot of critical technologies, so that you're not affected. So I think it'll reinforce that trend. I think if you're India, it will reinforce some of that, which is, you will say, look, tomorrow the West can sanction us, and we can be kept out of things. Now, one answer to that always is, are you planning to invade a country? If you're not, then you shouldn't worry about it. But India has faced sanctions, so it's not, again, an abstract concern. I think for India, it's a little harder for a different reason. They're not going to turn to the renminbi. A few years ago, when things were better between India and China, India, China, Russia used to talk about alternative payment schemes. India already has, they have a rupee ruble mechanism, they have a rupee real mechanism. But India has been essentially putting sanctions on China for the last 2 years. It's not going to link its security with the renminbi. And so, in fact, if anything, India thinks it's too over-dependent on China and trying to reduce its dependence. So that option has gone away for India. The second aspect is that India is actually, for all the grumbling about the West, former National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon says, the US is the essential country for India's transformation. Other countries, Russia might be an important partner, that the US is essential. And it's not just the US. If you look at India's trade, investment, India outsources its jobs problem essentially, right? Including with people like me who came here for jobs. So where Indians aren't going to Russia, some go to China, but even that has closed up. Indian students haven't been able to return to China for the last 2 years. So India is, even though ideologically it is, the anti-colonial kind of in that mode and still very much affected by it. And I think this is one of the things India will have to reconcile, which is how do you, for so many years, there's this idea that, the West is part of the problem. But then you have, are Japan and Australia the West? These are other countries that have become important to India. Is Eastern Europe the West? And the other thing is these countries have now become the major drivers for India's economic, technological, even military transformation, social transformation, cultural. There's higher education talks between the US and India. The hope is that these will finally take off and change the nature of the education relationship and the knowledge relationship between the two countries. You can't do that or India is not doing that with Russia and China. So the mindset, I absolutely agree with you, is there's going to be this, and I don't know how this will be reconciled, because I think it's a fundamental difference in India, which is self-reliance and wanting that, but then needing the world. And the way I describe it is India still is in that mode. And you see it in economic policy, you see it in trade policy, you see it in so many things, defense, where India, as a post-colonial country, is concerned about what the world can do to India, rather than thinking, what can the world do for India? But when you're policymakers, you can't transform India without capital, technology, know-how, jobs, skilling from abroad. And most of that is from the West writ large. It's not from Russia and China. And that fundamentally, China used to be the alternative for India, but that's not the case anymore. So unless something fundamentally changes in India-China relationship in the next 5 years, I think India is it's going to be, so the way I like to think about it is India has to change from thinking about self-reliance to resilience, which is you engage, you just find ways of mitigating the risk of overdependence, partly by not becoming overdependent and having your own solutions as well. And then, finally, don't go around invading other countries. You won't get sanctioned then.
Well, thank you, Tanvi. I think perhaps that's a good place to stop. But I'm going to make one more request. I think Ashok had made a comment in the chat and wanted to request that you respond to it. And in a way, it echoes Tim's question earlier on about certain kinds of political imaginaries in meeting realpolitik and strategic choices. So I'm wondering if you may say a few words about that, and then we can perhaps wrap things up.
So, I think you can't disconnect these, things like strategic cultures. And, it's one reason I went to a policy school and I didn't go to do my PhD in IR theory, because I didn't want to pick one. I didn't even think there was a picking combination, because I think you can't understand even India's strategic choices from a very geopolitical sense. So, realism would tell you India should have allied with the US. It didn't. So why doesn't India do alliances? It's because of how it sees itself. It's because of this kind of what we call now strategic culture. It's because it thinks about not wanting its decisions made in Washington or Moscow or Beijing. That is not necessarily the right move from a realpolitik point of view. Realpolitik would have said that India should have allied in the 50s and 60s, perhaps, if you were thinking about it purely from a security sense. And it was offered alliances as early as 1949. And so the US didn't want to ally with Pakistan. Preference was you ally with India. And Tim's read my book, so he knows this was kind of, it was mostly against China. But even then, that India both at that time had its own view of what it wanted to do and make its own decisions. But it also, there were other things that played a role, like thinking about, what was not then called the Global South, but we call the Global South now. But thinking about, for example, India and China together, because part of what the alliance would have been is, you contain China. And for India, and in language that we would find familiar, at least 10 years ago, it's out of fashion now, you had a Nehru saying to Truman that, no, Russia and China, he made 2 points. He says, one, Russia and China, communism is not as powerful as nationalism. And he's speaking from his own experience because he thought China and India, in fact, this ended up being a problem for him. He downplayed how much communist ideology actually mattered to Mao. And he thought that Mao was making, and this is kind of where kind of the democracy versus not, and very different experiences in kind of forming the countries that were formed within 2 years of each other, kind of in the new sense. But Nehru always thought, he mirror image. He thought, you know, Mao would make the same decisions he did because big countries wanting to develop, why would you decide to fight over land when you should be really focused on the economy? So of course, China's not going to fight. Of course, it's going to hold to agreements. And so he made this argument to Truman that, look, don't think of them as a communist monolith. He was right about that. He was just wrong by about 15 years. That Chinese nationalism would be more powerful than communism. But the second point he made was the way to actually, the approach to take to China was to engage with it and tie it into a web of interdependence. That if you isolated it, it would actually be left with only the Soviet option. That the way to actually make it a responsible stakeholder that we would, call it 20 years ago, was to actually tie it up in a web of interdependence. And these are his words. It's not me putting our globalization language now. And you did see that being one of the reasons he says, I don't want to ally, because if I allied, I wouldn't have the choice to build that relationship with China. So I think, realpolitik would have actually suggested a very different route for India than kind of that non-aligned route. And to this day, they don't call it non-alignment anymore. It's kind of weird to say non-alignment when there haven't been two blocks. But as I said, the most consistent element of Indian foreign policy has been, diversification. That's underlay non-alignment. It underlies today, and that comes from not from what we would consider kind of, yes, you can make a realpolitik argument for it, but you can't understand it with realpolitik alone. And I think that is because of how India imagines its own identity, which is not, as people put it, not a junior partner to the US. Or the way I often hear it said in India, the US needs to understand we are not Britain and we are not Japan. It's fairly insulting to the Brits and the Japanese, but nonetheless, that is what people say, that we are different. We are not just another Asian country.
Thank you. That was absolutely fabulous, and it is a really engaging and important conversation. And I think all of us really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. And I'd like everybody who came, I'd like to thank you guys. Especially many of my students who I see on this call for lingering to listen to, I think, a really, really important conversation. So thank you, everybody.